The Taken at Gordon Manor, Episode 9, The Reckoning. The first light of dawn broke cold and grey over the Sussex countryside, casting long shadows across the wheat fields that stretched out in all directions like a vast, indifferent sea. Celestina walked slowly along the dirt road that led back to Gordon Manor, her nightgown muddy and torn at the hem from where it had caught on brambles during her desperate walk to the fields, her bare feet aching with the bitter cold that seeped up through the packed earth and into her bones with each painful step. She had waited in that flattened circle of wheat until the sky began to lighten, waited with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, waited for them to come, for some sign, for some answer to her desperate plea that had echoed out into the darkness and been met with nothing but silence. Nothing. The field had remained empty, silent except for the rustle of wheat stalks in the pre-dawn breeze. The stars had faded one by one, indifferent to her suffering, indifferent to her mother's dying. And now the sun rose on a world that had not changed at all. A world where Georgie still lay upstairs in that great stone house, fighting for each shallow breath, while Celestina had accomplished nothing but to make herself cold and filthy and more desperate than before. Her mother was still dying, and they had not come. She reached the edge of the Gordon Manor grounds and paused, looking up at the great stone house with its tall chimneys from which smoke already rose, the servants already waking to begin their daily routines, as if this were an ordinary morning, as if the world were not ending one breath at a time in Georgie's bedchamber. The newer west wing caught the first light of dawn, its elegant windows beginning to glow with the warm flicker of candles being lit inside, while the older east wing where Celestina had slept as a child remained in shadow, ancient and cold and full of memories she could not quite grasp, but which made her skin prickle with unease all the same. She moved quietly through the garden, keeping to the shadows beneath the old oak trees, her feet leaving dark prints in the dew-wet grass. The trellis beneath her window creaked as she climbed, the old wood protesting her weight, and she felt it bite into her hands and arms, leaving fresh scratches along her skin that stung in the cold air. She winced but couldn't stop, pulling herself up hand over hand until she could slip through the window and into her room, just as she heard the first sounds of the household stirring below. The soft footsteps of servants moving through hallways, the distant clatter of the kitchen coming to life. She stripped off the muddy nightgown and hid it beneath her bed where no one would think to look, then washed quickly in the basin, the cold water stinging the scratches on her arms and making her gasp. By the time her lady's maid knocked softly at the door, Celestina was dressed in a simple morning gown and seated at her vanity, looking as composed as she could manage, though her eyes in the mirror were hollow and red-rimmed from crying, from exhaustion, from the terrible knowledge that she had failed. "Good morning, my lady," the maid said quietly as she entered, her eyes flicking to Celestina's face with concern before she looked away. "Shall I help you with your hair?" Celestina nodded, unable to speak, and watched her own reflection as the maid's hands worked to pin up her hair, covering the tangles and leaves that had caught in it during her walk through the fields, hiding the evidence of her desperate nighttime venture as if it had never happened at all. The dining room was silent except for the clink of silverware against china and the soft ticking of the mantel clock that marked each passing second with mechanical indifference. Morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows that overlooked the grounds, doing little to warm the cold formality of the meal or to dispel the tension that hung over the table like a storm cloud waiting to break. Celestina sat beside Manchester at the long mahogany table, her hands folded in her lap beneath the tablecloth, her breakfast untouched on the plate before her, though the smell of eggs and toast made her stomach turn with nausea. Across from them, Ruth picked at her food without eating, her face pale and drawn, while Timothy stared into his teacup as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. Dickie sat at the head of the table in his usual place, his jaw tight with suppressed anger, his movements sharp and irritable as he buttered his bread with more force than was necessary, the knife scraping against the china with a sound that made everyone wince. Manchester's gaze flickered to Celestina's wrists, where the scratches from the trellis showed faintly beneath her sleeves, thin red lines that stood out against her pale skin. He said nothing, but his eyes held questions she couldn't answer. Questions about where she had been and what she had done and why she looked so utterly defeated this morning. The footman entered with a silver tray bearing 3 sealed letters, his footsteps quiet on the carpet. He presented them to Dickie with a slight bow, then retreated to his position by the door to wait for further instructions. Dickie snatched the letters up, breaking the first seal with more force than was necessary, his fingers tearing through the wax. His eyes scanned the page, and his face, already flushed from some internal irritation, darkened to a deeper red that promised an explosion was coming. He opened the second letter, then the third, his jaw working as he read, his breathing growing heavier with each passing moment. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, filling the room like water rising in a closed space, until Ruth finally dared to speak, her voice small and hesitant. "Father, what is it?" Dickie slammed the letters down on the table with such force that the teacups rattled in their saucers, and Ruth jumped in her seat, her hand flying to her chest. "This," he snarled, his voice rising to fill the room, "is what happens when scandal follows a family. When a child disappears in the night and comes back, changed. The village has never forgotten it. What you've brought down upon this family." Manchester stiffened in his seat, his hand tightening on his napkin. "I beg your pardon?" "And now," Dickie continued, his face flushing deeper red, "we have more talk, more rumours. You arrive from London with your—" He waved his hand dismissively at Manchester. "Your lesser connections, your questionable lineage, and suddenly the village is in an uproar." "Father, please," Ruth began, but he turned on her with such fury that she fell silent immediately. "The magistrate writes to express his concerns about disturbances," Dickie read savagely from the first letter, his voice dripping with contempt. "Farmer Higgins demands compensation for destroyed crops. The vicar requests an urgent meeting about spiritual matters. Do you understand what this means? Do you comprehend the damage being done to this family's reputation?" Manchester's voice was measured, controlled, though there was steel beneath the courtesy. "With respect, sir, none of those things have anything to do with my arrival or my—" "Everything has changed since you came here," Dickie shouted, his fist coming down on the table again. "A gentleman of your station, marrying into this family. What did you expect? The village whispers, the servants talk, and now this, letters, official complaints. If she had never—" He stopped himself, his jaw working as he struggled to redirect his rage towards safer targets. If we had simply maintained our dignity, our privacy, none of this would have happened. A sound cut through his tirade, small and broken and terrible, a sob. They all turned as one, following the sound to its source. Georgie sat at the far end of the table where she had been propped in her chair by 2 footmen earlier that morning, a thick blanket tucked across her lap to keep her warm, cushions supporting her on either side to keep her upright. Her face was as vacant as ever, her eyes unseeing as they stared at nothing, her mouth slack and expressionless. But tears rolled slowly down her pale cheeks, leaving wet tracks on her skin that caught the morning light. The transformation in Dickie was instantaneous and complete, as if someone had doused the fire of his rage with cold water. "Georgie," he breathed, and all the anger drained from his voice, replaced by desperate tenderness. He pushed back from the table with such haste that his chair nearly toppled, then went to her side and knelt beside her chair, taking her limp hand in both of his. "Georgie, darling, it's all right. Don't cry. Shh, shh, my love. Everything is all right." He stroked her hands softly, his thumb moving over her knuckles in gentle circles, as if he could comfort her through touch alone, as if his tenderness could somehow reach through whatever darkness held her captive. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, my love. Everything will be all right, I promise. Everything will be fine." But Georgie's tears continued to fall, silent and terrible. Her face unchanging, her eyes still vacant and unseeing, as if she wept for sorrows too deep for expression, for losses too profound for words. Dickie looked around the table, his expression suddenly lost, almost childlike in its confusion, all his earlier fury transformed into bewildered helplessness. "It's the village," he said, his voice uncertain now, grasping for explanations. "They're turning against us. The rumours, the weather has been terrible, hasn't it? Unseasonable. The storms, the servants are anxious. Everyone is on edge. It's not our fault. None of this is our fault. How can any of this be our fault?" No one answered him because there was no answer to give, no comfort to offer that would make any of this less terrible. Ruth looked away, her jaw tight with unshed tears. Timothy stared at his plate, his hands clenched into fists on the tablecloth. Manchester's hand found Celestina's beneath the table, squeezing gently, offering what comfort he could. And Dickie turned back to Georgie, still murmuring soft reassurances to her blank, weeping face, still stroking her hand, as if his touch could somehow bring her back to him. The previous morning, before dawn had fully broken over the countryside, Higgins walked through his wheat field with his lantern swinging in his calloused hand, its light casting long shadows across the stalks that bent in the pre-dawn breeze. The storm that had battered the countryside for days had finally passed in the night, leaving the air cold and still and heavy with moisture that made his breath mist before his face. His shoulders ached from yesterday's labour, and he was looking forward to getting the cows into the barn and then going back to his cottage for a hot breakfast. But the animals had been restless all night, and he wanted to check on them before the day's work began in earnest. He was halfway to the barn when he saw it, and his footsteps faltered to a stop. A perfect circle lay before him in the wheat, perhaps 30 feet across, the stalks flattened in a precise spiral pattern as if pressed down by some great invisible weight. The edges were sharp and deliberate, the wheat bent but not broken, lying in neat rows that curved inward toward the centre in a pattern that made his eyes hurt to follow. And in the centre of that impossible circle lay his prize milk cow. "Christ have mercy," Higgins whispered, and his voice sounded small and frightened in the pre-dawn silence. He rushed forward, his boots crushing the flattened wheat beneath his feet, and dropped to his knees beside the animal. He pressed his hand to her flank, hoping against hope to feel warmth, to feel the rise and fall of breath. But the cow was cold beneath his palm, stiff with rigor mortis that told him she had been dead for hours. There was no blood, no wound that he could see, nothing to explain how a healthy animal had simply died in the middle of his field. Just smooth circular burn marks on her hide, each one perfectly round, each one too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be anything but intentional. The marks were raised slightly, as if the flesh beneath had been seared by something intensely hot, and when he touched one with trembling fingers, the texture was wrong, slick and almost glassy. The cow's eyes were open, wide and glassy black, reflecting his lantern like dark mirrors that seemed to hold accusation in their depths. Enos jerked his hand back with a gasp, his heart hammering in his chest. The smell hit him then, sharp and chemical. Nothing like the earthy scent of his fields or the familiar odour of livestock. It was like ozone after lightning, but stronger, more acrid, mixed with something metallic that made his nose burn and his eyes water. The smell seemed to come from the circle itself, from the flattened wheat and the scorched earth and the dead animal at its centre. He stood slowly, backing away from the circle, and looked toward the pasture where his other cows should have been waiting to be brought in for milking. They were there, clustered at the far fence, pressed against the rails as far from this field as they could get, their eyes rolling white with fear. "Come on then," he called to them, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound commanding. "Come on! Time for milking!" Nothing. The cows shifted nervously but didn't budge from their position at the far fence. Higgins grabbed a switch from the fence post and waved it in the air, making the sharp, cracking sound that usually sent them running. "Ha! Move! Come on, you stupid beasts!" Still nothing. If anything, they pressed harder against the fence, their heads turning away from him, from the field, from whatever invisible thing they could sense, but he could not. He tried everything then, growing more desperate with each failed attempt. He coaxed them with the sweetest hay from the barn. He threatened them with the switch, though he would never actually strike them. He even went back to the barn for grain, the expensive stuff they loved, that they would normally trample each other to get to, and scattered it on the ground near the circle. But no matter what he did, the cattle would not cross into the field where the circle lay. They wouldn't even approach it. It was as if there was an invisible wall there, a boundary they could sense with some animal instinct that he lacked, something that warned them away with more authority than his voice, or his threats, or even their own hunger could overcome. And standing there in the cold morning air, Higgins could feel it too now that he stood still and paid attention. The air inside the circle was different, thicker somehow, as if it had more substance than ordinary air. It pressed against his chest in a way that made breathing difficult, made his lungs work harder for each breath. And there was a feeling, a wrongness, like standing too close to something dangerous, something that wanted to harm him but hadn't decided yet whether he was worth the effort. He turned slowly, looking toward Gordon Manor in the distance where it sat on its hill overlooking the valley, its chimneys just beginning to smoke as the household woke. He remembered the blue light he'd seen last night, hovering over his field, moving with deliberate purpose. Too bright to be a lantern, too steady to be lightning, too purposeful to be anything natural. The same blue light he'd seen on and off for weeks now, always drifting near the manor, always appearing when that Grover girl was somewhere nearby. The little Grover girl who'd been touched by something unholy when she was 7 years old, who'd disappeared for hours and come back changed, wrong in some fundamental way that everyone could sense even if they couldn't name it. The girl who'd married that strange gentleman from London just days ago in a rushed wedding that the whole village had whispered about. Higgins looked down at his dead cow, at the perfect burn marks, at the flattened wheat that formed a pattern no natural force could create, and felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. This was her doing. It had to be. She'd brought something to the village, something dark and terrible, and now it was here among them, killing livestock, destroying crops, marking the land with signs that made his skin crawl. And if she'd brought it here, then she needed to answer for it. Later that morning, Celestina climbed the stairs to her mother's room, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the weight of her failure was a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. The hallway was quiet, except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock at the landing, and the distant sounds of servants moving through the lower floors, their voices muted by walls and distance. The curtains in Georgie's bedchamber were drawn against the morning light, leaving the room in dim golden half-light that seemed appropriate for a sick room, for a place where life was slowly ebbing away. Georgie lay propped up in bed with pillows supporting her on either side, her breathing shallow and laboured, each breath a rattling sound that seemed to echo in the quiet room. The physician had left an hour ago with nothing but a sad shake of his head and quiet words that Celestina had heard from the hallway. "There's nothing more I can do, I'm afraid. It's only a matter of time now. Perhaps hours, perhaps days, but prepare yourselves." Celestina pulled a chair close to the bed, the legs scraping softly against the floorboards, and took her mother's cold hand in both of hers. The skin was papery thin, cool to the touch, the bones beneath feeling fragile as a bird's. "I tried, Mother," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "I tried to get them to help you. I went out to the field last night, to the place where the wheat was flattened, and I..." I begged them, the ones who took me when I was 7, the ones with the blue lights and the black eyes. I thought if I asked them, if I offered myself in exchange, if I... Her voice broke completely and she had to stop, had to press her free hand to her mouth to hold back the sobs that threatened to tear free. But they wouldn't come, she managed after a moment, the words barely audible. They didn't come. I waited and I called to them and I begged, but they didn't care. They don't care about us. They never have. And I don't know what to do. I don't know how to save you. Georgie's breathing continued its shallow mechanical rhythm, her eyes staring at the ceiling with that terrible vacancy that had become so familiar over these past weeks. Celestina squeezed her mother's hand, willing her to respond, to show some sign that she heard, that she knew Celestina was there and trying and failing and desperate. "I'm so sorry," Celestina whispered, the tears coming freely now. "I'm so..." Georgie's head turned. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, her neck moving with unnatural precision, vertebrae clicking in a way that made Celestina's stomach lurch. Georgie's head snapped to the side until she was looking directly at Celestina, and her eyes were focused, sharp, aware in a way they hadn't been for weeks. "Who?" The word was clear, crisp, utterly lucid, and it cut through the quiet room like a blade. Celestina froze, her breath catching in her throat, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Mother!" "Who?" Georgie repeated. And now there was something desperate in her voice, something urgent and terrified that made the hair on the back of Celestina's neck stand up. The ones who took me," Celestina stammered, her words tumbling over each other. "When I was 7, the ones with the blue lights, the tall figures with the black eyes who came to my room and took me and..." Georgie started shaking, not trembling, not quivering, but shaking violently, her whole body convulsing as if something inside her was trying to tear itself free. Her back arched off the pillows, her hands clawing at the bedclothes, her eyes rolling back in her head until only the whites showed. "No," she gasped, and the word came out strangled. "Wrong. Mother, No, 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 no." Her voice rose with each repetition, climbing from a whisper to a shriek, and the shaking grew more violent, her head thrashing from side to side, her teeth chattering together with enough force that Celestina feared she would bite through her tongue. It was like possession, like something inside Georgie was screaming to get out, like her mother's body had become a battleground for forces Celestina couldn't see or understand. "Mother!" Celestina grabbed her shoulders, trying to hold her still, but Georgie was stronger than she should have been, fueled by whatever terrible thing had seized control of her. "Mother, please, it's all right, I'm here, you're safe." But Georgie wasn't safe, and neither was Celestina. And they both knew it, even if Celestina couldn't articulate the knowledge that pulsed through her with sick certainty. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Georgie went still, her body settling back against the pillows, her breathing returning to that shallow, mechanical rhythm. Her eyes fixed on the ceiling again, vacant and empty, her face slack with no trace of the awareness that had been there moments before. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Celestina backed away, her hands shaking, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, could feel it in her throat. She stared at her mother's blank face, at the rise and fall of her chest, at the fingers that had been clawing at the bedclothes now lying still and peaceful at her sides. The door burst open and the physician hurried in, summoned by the commotion, his bag clutched in one hand. "What happened?" he demanded, going immediately to Georgie's side, checking her pulse, her breathing, peeling back her eyelids to examine her pupils. I don't know," Celestina whispered, her voice thin and scared. She looked at me. She spoke. She was aware. And then she started shaking and screaming, and then she just stopped. The physician examined Georgie for a long moment, his frown deepening with each passing second. before he finally straightened and turned to Celestina with grave eyes. "Her condition is deteriorating rapidly, I'm afraid," he said quietly. "The body often shows these sorts of episodes near the end, moments of lucidity followed by distress. It's not uncommon. There's truly nothing more I can do. I would suggest preparing yourselves. It won't be long now. A day at most, perhaps only hours." He gathered his bag and left the room quietly, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Celestina sank back into the chair, staring at her mother's blank face, her mind reeling with questions that had no answers. Who had Georgie been talking to in that moment of terrible clarity? What had she seen when Celestina mentioned them? What memory had been triggered that had made her scream with such primal terror? And why, in that brief moment of awareness, had her mother looked not at Celestina, but past her, at something standing just beyond Celestina's shoulder that Celestina herself could not see? The previous evening, just after dusk, had settled over the village. Thomas walked the road that passed by Gordon Manor on his way home from the forge, his shoulders aching and his clothes smelling of smoke and hot iron from the long day's work of blacksmithing. He'd stayed late to finish a commission for the squire, a set of decorative hinges for his new stable doors, and now his muscles complained with every step, and his thoughts were focused entirely on his supper and his wife's warm fire and perhaps a pipe before bed. The road was empty in the gathering darkness, the light fading fast as the sun disappeared behind the western hills. He quickened his pace, eager to be home before full dark fell, his boots making rhythmic sounds on the packed earth that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat after 20 years of walking this same route. The blue light appeared from nowhere, flooding the road ahead of him in brilliant cold radiance that was nothing like the warm flicker of lamplight or the natural glow of twilight. This was something else, something wrong, a light that hurt to look at directly and yet drew the eye with irresistible force. Thomas stopped mid-step, one foot raised, his breath catching in his throat. The light surrounded him, pressing in from all sides like water, filling his vision until he could see nothing else, until the world narrowed to blue radiance and the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He tried to move, tried to run, tried to do anything, but his body wouldn't respond. His legs were frozen in place, his arms locked at his sides. Even his lungs seemed paralyzed so that his breath came in shallow gasps that didn't seem to bring enough air. The paralysis was absolute, total, terrifying in its completeness. He could only stand there, rigid and helpless, a prisoner in his own body as the light grew brighter, colder, more intense with each passing second. And then he felt them. Hands. Not hands exactly, but the sensation of hands, invisible fingers pressing against his chest, his shoulders, his face with a touch that was neither warm nor cold, but something else entirely, something that made his skin crawl even though he couldn't move away. The pressure was firm, insistent, holding him in place with strength that was effortless and terrible in its casual power. His vision began to tunnel, the edges of his sight going dark, the world shrinking to a pinpoint of blue light that pulsed in rhythm with his racing heart. And through it all he could hear a sound, high-pitched and piercing, like metal scraping against glass, like machinery grinding, like something alive and wrong making noises that no living thing should make. The sound made his teeth ache, made his skull feel like it was splitting open, made him want to scream except that he couldn't move his jaw, couldn't force air through his throat, couldn't do anything but stand there and endure, and then nothing. Thomas jerked awake with a gasp that tore through his throat, his whole body convulsing as if he'd been struck by lightning. The sky was full dark now, with stars bright overhead, like chips of ice against black velvet. His whole body ached as if he'd been thrown from a great height, every muscle screaming in protest as he pushed himself up to sitting, his head spinning with disorientation. He looked down at himself in the dim starlight and felt fresh horror wash through him. His clothes were wrong. His shirt was on backwards, the buttons in the back, the collar twisted around. His boots were untied, the laces trailing in the dirt. And when he held up his hands, he could see mud caked under his fingernails, dark crescents that shouldn't be there because he'd been walking on a paved road, because there was no mud anywhere near where he'd been. He staggered to his feet, swaying with dizziness. He had to crawl out of the ditch which he had lied in and began the long walk home with his thoughts churning in confusion and rising fear. He was lying in a ditch 3 miles from where he'd been standing before, with no recollection of how he got there. When he finally reached his cottage, stumbling up to the door on legs that barely held him, his wife threw it open with such force that it banged against the wall, her face pale with worry and anger and relief all mixed together. "Where have you been?" she cried, and there were tears on her cheeks. "You've been gone for 4 hours, Thomas. 4 hours. I thought something terrible had happened to you." 4? Thomas shook his head, trying to make sense of her words. "No, I left the forge just after sunset. It can't have been more than..." But when he looked at the clock on the mantel, he saw she was right. 4 hours. 4 hours of his life just gone. Vanished. Lost to a blue light and invisible hands, and a sound that still echoed in his skull when he closed his eyes. He looked down at his arms in the lamplight and saw them clearly for the first time. Strange marks dotted his forearm in a precise pattern. Not bruises exactly, though they were purple and raised. They were geometric, perfect triangles arranged in a line, each one identical to the others, each one too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. He'd never seen anything like them in his life, had no explanation for how they'd gotten there or what they meant. Whatever was happening in this village made his skin crawl and his heart race with primal fear. Evening settled over Gordon Manor like a heavy blanket, the house growing quiet as servants moved through their tasks with hushed voices and careful footsteps. Celestina stood at her mother's window, looking out at the darkening grounds, at the trees that were losing their definition in the fading light, at the road that wound down toward the village, where lamps were beginning to flicker to life in cottage windows. Manchester found her there, his footsteps soft on the carpet, his presence a warmth at her back, before he spoke. "We need to leave," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "Tonight, as soon as it's dark enough." Celestina didn't turn from the window. "I can't leave my mother, she's dying. If we stay, you'll die." His voice was harder now, insistent, coloured with fear that he was trying to control. "Do you understand what they do to accused witches in this country? What they're already saying in the village? I've heard the whispers, Celestina. The servants talk, the villagers talk. It's only a matter of time before..." "She just looked at me," Celestina interrupted, her voice soft but filled with wonder and horror, all mixed together. For the first time in weeks, she saw me. She knew me. Her eyes were clear and aware, and she spoke to me, Manchester. She actually spoke. And I can't leave her now. Not when she might come back to me. Not when there's still hope that she might... "There's no hope," Manchester said, and his voice was gentle now but firm. "The physician said it himself. It's only a matter of time. Hours, perhaps. A day at most. And when it happens, when she dies, the village will blame you for that too. They'll say you cursed her. They'll say you killed her with witchcraft, and then they'll come for you with torches and pitchforks and righteous fury, and there will be nothing I can do to stop them." Celestina finally turned to face him, her eyes fierce despite the tears that threatened to spill over. "Then leave. I'm staying." "I'm not leaving without you," Manchester said immediately, his jaw set with stubborn determination. "We can go to my manor," he began. "And abandon her on her deathbed?" Celestina's voice broke on the words. "Leave her to die alone while I run away to save my own skin? What kind of daughter would I be? What kind of person? I've failed her already, Manchester. I went to them last night and I begged them to save her, and they didn't come. They didn't care. But I'm not going to fail her again by leaving her now, not when she needs me most." Manchester was silent for a long moment, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as he struggled with something internal, some battle between what he knew was wise and what he knew she needed. "Your stubbornness will get us both killed," he said finally. But there was resignation in his voice now, acceptance of what she'd already decided. He began to hope that Georgie would pass speedily, and then they could slip away before the village would come for Celestina. "Then leave," she repeated, more gently this time. "I won't blame you. You have your own life, your own estate to think of. You don't have to stay here and risk yourself for my sake. Our marriage does not mean nothing to me. You," he stammered, "do not mean nothing to me. You don't realize it yet, but you are the only person in the world that can possibly understand me. And I, you. I'm not leaving without you," he said again, and this time there was finality in the words. "So if you're staying, I'm staying. But after the funeral, after it's over, we leave immediately. No arguments, no delays. We get as far from this village as we can before they can organize themselves into a mob. Agreed?" Celestina nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat, and when Manchester pulled her into his arms, she went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and letting herself take comfort in his solid presence, in the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. They stood together in the gathering darkness, both of them knowing that time was running out, that the clock was ticking down towards something terrible, that the village's fear and anger were building like a storm that would soon break over all their heads. But for now, for this moment, they had each other, and they would face whatever came together. The slippery blackness of midnight had arrived. The household was summoned by a servant's urgent knock on doors throughout the manor, the message whispered but understood by all. It was time. The physician had been clear in his final visit that evening. Georgie would not see another dawn. They gathered in her bedchamber in a solemn procession, footsteps muffled by carpet, voices hushed out of respect for the dying. Dickie sat beside the bed in a chair that had been pulled close, holding his wife's hand in both of his face grey and haggard in the candlelight, his eyes fixed on Georgie's face as if he could hold her here through sheer force of will. Ruth stood at the foot of the bed with Timothy's arm around her shoulders, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth to stifle the sobs that kept trying to escape. Manchester and Celestina stood near the window, and several servants waited quietly by the door, come to pay their final respects to their mistress who had always been kind to them, always fair, always generous even in her final illness. The room was warm despite the cold night outside, a fire burning in the hearth and candles lit on every surface so that Georgie would not die in darkness, so that her passage from this world to the next would be illuminated by light and warmth and the presence of those who loved her. Georgie's breathing had become a terrible rattling sound that filled the room and seemed to echo off the walls. Each breath seemed like it might be her last, each pause between breaths stretching so long that everyone held their own breath waiting to see if another would come. And when it did, when that awful rattle sounded again, there was relief and dread all mixed together because it meant she was still suffering, still trapped in this failing body, still unable to find peace. Celestina watched her mother's face, willing her to open her eyes one more time, to see her, to know her, to give some sign that she was aware and not alone in these final moments. But Georgie's gaze remained fixed on the ceiling, vacant to the very end, her hand limp in Dickie's desperate grasp. And then, quite suddenly, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was profound, absolute, a stillness that seemed to swallow all sound and movement as everyone froze, listening, waiting, hoping against hope that it was just another long pause and that the breathing would start again. But it didn't. Dickie made a small, broken sound in his throat. "Georgie? Georgie, no, please." His voice cracked, and he lifted her hand to his cheek, pressing it there as if the touch of her skin could somehow bring her back. "Please don't leave me, please. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry for everything, for all of it. Please come back, please." Celestina felt her knees buckle, felt Manchester's arms catch her and hold her upright as a sob tore from her throat that she couldn't contain, couldn't control. "Mother," she whispered, and the word came out strangled, broken. "Mother, no." And then the room filled with blue light. It came through every window at once, flooding the chamber in cold, brilliant radiance that was nothing like the warm flicker of candles or the soft glow of lamplight. This was something else entirely, something otherworldly, a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, that filled every corner of the room and left no shadow anywhere. "No one dare make a move to Eve breathe." Dickie stared at the windows, his face white as chalk, his mouth open in shock. Ruth gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Timothy stepped back, pulling Ruth with him, his other hand reaching for something to hold onto as if the world had suddenly tilted beneath his feet. The servants backed toward the door, their faces reflecting the same primal fear that was written on everyone else. The light pulsed, once, twice, like breathing, like a heartbeat, like something alive watching them, observing their grief with cold, clinical interest. Manchester's arms tightened around Celestina until she could barely breathe. "Don't move," he whispered against her hair, his voice shaking. "Don't make a sound." The light grew brighter still, so bright it hurt to look at, so bright that the shadows in the room disappeared entirely, and everything was bathed in that cold blue radiance that made everyone's skin look corpse pale, that turned the warm candlelit chamber into something strange and terrible and wrong. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The room plunged back into the warm glow of candlelight, the fire crackling in the hearth, the night pressing close against the windows once more. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Everyone just stood there, staring at the windows, at each other, trying to understand what they had just witnessed, what it meant, whether they had all truly seen the same impossible thing. Then Dickie's voice, thin and shaking, broke the silence. What was that?" Ruth turned to him, and when she spoke, her voice was high and tight with barely controlled hysteria. "We all saw it. We all saw it. The light, the blue light, just like she said." "The light," Timothy whispered, his face pale. "It was just like she described when she was a child. The blue light that came to her room. The blue light that took her." And slowly, inevitably, all eyes turned to Celestina. She didn't notice their stares, their fear, their dawning understanding. She had pulled free from Manchester's arms and stumbled to the bed, collapsing beside her mother's body with a cry that came from somewhere deep in her chest. "Mother," she sobbed, clutching Georgie's cold hand in both of hers, pressing it to her cheek, to her lips. "Mother, please, please don't go. Please don't leave me. I love you. I'm so sorry. For everything. For not being able to save you. For not being good enough. For bringing this curse to our family. Mother, please." But Georgie was gone, her eyes staring sightless at the ceiling, her chest still, her hand growing colder with each passing second. And the blue light had come to witness her passing. They had all seen it now. All of them. There could be no more denying, no more dismissing Celestina's stories as childhood fantasy or illness-induced delusion. The blue light was real. And it had come when Georgie died, as if summoned by her death, as if waiting for this exact moment, as if it had always been watching. To be continued.